Welcome. I'm Dulwa Kowa, and you're listening to the Dear Diaspora podcast. Dear Diaspora exists to host meaningful, Africa-centered conversations about all things culture, business, mental health, politics, and more. Join me and guests as we ask the big questions, challenge narratives surrounding Africa, learn and unlearn, and explore what a more connected, collaborative, and engaged African diaspora can look like. Today's episode of Dear Diaspora explores the question, why hasn't Africa developed as fast as other continents? As you can imagine, this is a really huge, super nuanced, super layered question. Nevertheless, Joy Malonza and I tackled this question head-on with zero filter. Joy Malonza is the founder of the downballot.org, a platform that aims to help voters translate progressive politics into proxies through electoralism and community organizing. Joy is super passionate about how the intersections between class, race, and gender impact the manner through which individuals interact with society and vice versa. I met Joy on Instagram. She's an excellent writer, and just all of the content that she shares is always super educational, super nuanced, and I just love her perspective. During the episode, we dig into Africa's patterns of development before the transatlantic slave trade and colonization, the legacy of colonization in Africa, how institutions like the World Bank and IMF have impacted Africa's development, why capitalism doesn't work in Africa, and why rich Africans essentially are not our friends, and why socialism may or may not be the answer. I also want to note that the views and opinions that are expressed in this episode are my own and do not represent any organization that I am currently affiliated with. Without further ado, here is our conversation. Joy, I am so excited to have you on the show and dive into this very fascinating and big topic. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Before we get started, do you want to kind of introduce yourself to the audience? Like, where are you from? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Joy Malonza. I grew up originally in Kenya for 9 years, then I moved to the US when I was 9. So I've been here ever since then. And during the daytime, I work in advertising. I help capitalists capitalize. But after my day job, I'm very critical of those same capitalists. So that's what I do. And as of my day job, I have an organization that I run with some of my friends called the Down Ballot, where we essentially tie people to their elected officials and highlight the importance of electoral politics and progressive movements. Yeah.
Awesome. Such a pleasure to have you on the show. I love your content on the Down Ballot, obviously. And y'all, if you have never heard of the Down Ballot, please check it out. Follow them on all the social media. They put out super great, super like bold content and educational content. And I love it. So yes, thank you again, Joy. So our topic today is essentially, why hasn't Africa developed as fast as other continents? This is a pretty big topic and a pretty heavy one, considering, this is multi-layered, multifaceted, and, Africa is not a country. It's a continent with 54 very distinct, very diverse nations. And so, I thought this would be like a really cool thing to kind of dive into, just given that it's something that a lot of people are curious about, people are often, Googling things like, why is Africa so poor? That's like a very, like a highly ranked, search term or whatever. And so, yeah, I thought you'd be the perfect person to kind of dive into this. Any kind of thoughts before we, dive into more of like the research and things?
Yeah, this is definitely a huge, insanely huge topic, but I think that some of the things we're going to tackle throughout this episode, dig into the economics of Africa's history and why things have been so difficult in terms of progression. One of the things that I always shy away from is the idea of the cultural argument. That's something that a lot of people do bring up. I studied economics in university, and whenever this topic was broached, it was always this sort of like, well, maybe Africa's culture is just not conducive to economic growth. That would always really bother me intensely, because these sort of culture arguments obscure the reality of the economic impacts of certain policies that have held Africa back from, of course, slavery on both coasts, not just on the Atlantic coast, but also on the East Coast, and then to colonization, and then to modern post-colonialism. So oftentimes this idea of African culture will obscure the path towards really critiquing what's at the heart of why Africa has not been able to develop, which is the economics of it. Of course, economics is difficult, it's dense, it's hard to fully understand, and I think that that's why people often have difficulty with this topic, but we're going to dig into it. Yeah.
Yes, and I so appreciate you pointing that out, because I think that sort of, I guess, like narrative or rhetoric about like our culture not being conducive to like economic growth is just like, first, I think it's like erasure of like our history just as a continent, all that we've been able to do these past few centuries. And then I also think it's like, because like you said, it is like very complex and has to do with like economics and things, people just take the easy route and say, oh, it's the people, it's the culture. But it's like,
exactly.
No, it's, and I feel like that's actually rooted in like anti-Blackness too, and like, and white supremacy. Yeah, anti-Blackness, white supremacy, the notion that, Black Africans, for instance, aren't as capable. And that's why you don't see as much growth as you would, on other continents. So yes, thank you so much for pointing that out. And I think before we get into the topic, I also agree that it's important to like put the onus on policies, governments, corporations, and not like individuals, because oftentimes we are at the mercy, essentially, of these large systems that often aren't built to like be there for us, support us, ensure that we have our basic needs met. So I very much do shy away from like blaming this on like the people, the culture, because it's systems essentially that need to be held accountable. Yes. And so let's start by maybe just chatting through some history and just providing like a little bit of context to really understand like where Africa is today. Doing some research, there was this quote that kind of stood out. Yeah, so I was actually really surprised by this quote and almost shocked because this quote is from like an African person. But the quote goes, Western science led to the invention of gunpowder and other superior military weapons that outclassed bows, arrows, and spears. Combined with the development of shipping transportation, the West became intrepid explorers of the world, developed a worldview of racial superiority, which led it to achieve military and economic conquests that resulted in transatlantic slavery and colonialism. So essentially what this article was trying to say is that the thing that's been missing from Africa is our ability to innovate or our ability to make advancements in like science and technology. And I have a huge problem with this to begin with, because he essentially challenges Africans to be innovative, which almost erases the fact that like the continent's growth and progress was essentially like put to a halt by the slave trade and by colonization. And it ignores the fact that, prior to slavery and colonization, we were doing things. We were inventing things. We were traveling, across the continent, all over the world and things like that. So I thought it would be really important to just provide like some historical context, because you really can't understand like Africa today without understanding the history of the continent.
Yeah, definitely. And I think something that this quote really brings to mind is sort of this survival of the fittest mentality that a lot of people have towards when we talk about like history and what people achieved in their history and what made them susceptible to being conquered or being conquerors. It always sort of boils down to this idea that, well, this society developed this. So that means when they came to conquer your society, it was not a matter of racism or eugenics or any of these factors. It was a matter of the fact that they were stronger than you. And I have wrestled with the fact that on some level, it is true that when we look at how things developed, not along the coastline of the continent, but sort of when we look at the hinterland, they did develop at a slower rate. They didn't develop at the rate of, societies that were more on the coast or among the Arab trade routes. So, for example, you look at countries like Mali currently, but of course back then they weren't countries. They were more nations or like states or kingdoms, all that. Basically, when thinking about, okay, so how did Africa develop? Why were things in the hinterland slower to develop than things along the coastline? Well, of course, the rate of development when you're along the coastline, when you're interacting with other societies, is going to look different than when you're in the hinterland, especially because when you look at the African hinterland, jungles, forests, really difficult to traverse. So, of course, some of the innovations that were taking place at the coastline weren't going to necessarily penetrate into the interior. So, I know something that I've always wrestled with is the idea of, why did certain societies on the continent develop at a slower rate? When you look at the geography of the continent, it all begins to make sense. Some of the most quote unquote developed civilizations on the African continent are along the North African coast, for example. Why is that? If you ask white supremacists, they're going to say because they're not Black, because they figured it out, because they interacted with Europeans. But no, the answer is that they interacted with other groups of people, shared those ideas, took back certain ideas, invented certain ideas, whatever it was. And that's how that growth was perpetuated. Whereas, even for example, in the East African coast, I'm from a tribe that would trade on the East African coast with the Arab traders who would come and like exchange goods for slaves. Yes, that is a part of our history, which is a sad part of our history. But in terms of actually bringing a lot of innovation that was seen on the Swahili coast back into the interior, it was extremely difficult. You'd only have a couple of travelers going to the coast, bringing things back, and oftentimes it wasn't the knowledge of how to actually expand or to do plumbing. But on the Swahili coast, there was plumbing because people were able to directly implement that new knowledge on the coastline.
Absolutely. And I'm not too familiar with, for instance, a deep level of like Egypt's history, but I would imagine the Nile, proximity to that made it so much easier for them to, travel, exchange ideas, like move about in comparison to other regions on the continent that are in environments that maybe aren't as conducive to travel and things like that.
Yes, definitely. And I think also when you think about the fact that Egypt, where it's nestled, it's on the African continent. It also has the Sinai Peninsula, which bridges it with Asia. And then across the Mediterranean, just the halfway away is Europe. So, of course, there was going to be a lot of interaction, innovation going on in that corner of the planet. So people say, well, why did North Africa develop and you guys didn't? There's clear answers as to what exactly took place there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there were other, like historically, other civilizations, like outside of Egypt specifically, that were also forming their own like patterns of development, essentially. Like we mentioned, like Mali earlier. Like
Exactly.
there was like Great Zimbabwe, and
Ethiopia,
yeah. So it's like there was activity, even if it may have looked different. Like there were already existing patterns of development prior to colonization and prior to slavery, essentially. And I think it's important to like start with that, given like that quote earlier from the guy that basically made it seem like we just weren't doing squat until the white people came.
Exactly.
Yes, yes. And so our development obviously was interrupted by slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and colonization. So around like the 1400s, first Europeans from Portugal specifically like landed on the African continent and began to do certain activities like cultivating like sugar plantains off the west coast of Africa. From then on, an estimated, 11 million people were forcibly taken into slavery in the New World. And it's just crazy I think it's crazy to think that that sort of disruption hasn't impacted our continent's like growth and development. And then as colonization as like a system became like the norm across the continent, the types of economies that were developed essentially were like very extractive. So essentially they were built to enrich the countries that were colonizing the African countries. And life as we knew it at that point was completely disrupted, which is, it's crazy to think that that started, hundreds of years ago, and we're still essentially living in a time that's been impacted by just how brutal and destructive those systems were.
100%. And I think also something else a lot of people don't know about is the slave trade that took people from the East African coast, not just from the East African coast, but also from the East African interior to Western Asia, which would be like the Arabian Peninsula, India as well, more in South Asia, and of course also places like Iran, which were back then known as Persia. There was a lot of trade that also stole individuals from their own societies on the East African coast, and also the East African interior, and took them into foreign lands. That particular slave trade is really not heavily discussed. It's forgotten by the sands of time, unfortunately. But all these things were destabilizing forces. And then, of course, also, not just that, but there was always the removal of individuals from and I hate this term, sub-Saharan portion of the continent towards the north, to then also be sold into Europe, or just be sold along the caravan of North African enslavement, which took a lot of the people from the sub-Saharan portion of the continent. So all these things were destabilizing forces. And you're absolutely right. With colonization, it was all about extraction of raw material to fuel industry in Europe, which was, of course, the colonizing force at the time. And I think that at the heart of this is why it always baffles me when people don't focus on the economics of oppression, because at the heart of colonization was economic might. It was a trend towards capitalism. And although versions of capitalism have evolved over time, so capitalism hasn't always been called capitalism, and it hasn't always functioned the exact same ways. But when we think about colonization, what it really wanted was free labor, free capital, or cheap capital, cheap labor, whatever it was, in order to fuel industry for high profits. At the end of the day, when we really boil it down, that is what capitalism is at its heart.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to me, even this whole discussion about, why Africa hasn't quote unquote developed, I think is just, even that needs to be examined, because if you look at how quote unquote first world or the more developed world or global north, if you think about how they've essentially built their wealth and grown their economies, it's been off of the backs of Black and brown people around the world, African people especially. And it's like, if they literally had to dominate the world, kill people, colonize people, and just essentially leave these former colonies completely just decimated. Like, if it took all of that for them to be in the positions they are today, does that even count? Like, I feel like it doesn't count. These whatever economic indicators like GDP and, the way we measure like how well a country's doing, it's like, I feel like it's completely just unfair even to compare how the US is doing, for instance, in comparison to like an African country, because the US has had a, 400-year head start.
Exactly.
400-year head start. And essentially, like, yeah, literally had to enslave people for hundreds of years for them to be in the position that they are today. I don't even think, like, let's say colonization and slavery didn't happen, I don't think that we would have like followed this pattern of development. Like, we would have grown, like we would have, continued to trade and do things like in our own way. But this whole like aspect of domination and colonization and slavery, I think it's just so unfair that that's the way a lot of these economies have grown to the extent that they have today.
100%. I think that's something that a lot of people sometimes, I've heard this rhetoric before, which is that without colonization, Africa would never have developed. And that's a very, not only racist perspective, but it's a very patronizing perspective. The idea that Africans need to be brutalized in order to be brought into the 21st century. But unfortunately, it's something that a lot of people do say and sort of like replicate without an understanding of why, quote unquote, Africa developed during that time. Africa did not develop during that time. There was infrastructure built in order to transport raw materials. There was infrastructure built in order to transport laborers. That was why it seems to develop during colonization. Colonization was 100% a plundering force. And you're right, when it comes down to it, there was trade taking place regardless. There were interactions with different people taking place regardless. Colonization isn't the reason why things were propelled forward. Things would have moved forward anyway because of all interactions that were taking place. Even though certain parts, for example, the Congo, certain parts of Africa were left out of ancient trade routes because they were just way too remote to access and all of that. But even coming up against 20th century, when we have more industrialized methods of getting across thickets and jungles and being able to really navigate across dangerous terrain that would make different communities isolated, there did not necessarily have to be plunder associated with the exchange of innovation, of information, all of that. But the plunder came as a result of, oh, this is an opportunity to extract, to take, and to power our own industries at a very, very low cost, which is always going to be the point of capitalism. That was a point of colonization. That was a point of exploitation. So whenever I hear people who are like very, very much pro African independence and people who are talk about like African liberation, but they're not anti-capitalists, I just get confused because I'm like, what do you mean? How is this one thing supposed to happen when you're not ready to tackle what's at the heart of that exploitation?
And I feel like, from what I've kind of observed and read, I think it's a lack of even just understanding of what capitalism as a system like really is and how damaging it actually is. I think, even for me, I've just recently gained a better understanding of just how, dangerous essentially of a system it is. But I think for some people, it's just like, oh, like, of course we want, these big corporations in our countries. It means that there's more economic activity and there are more jobs for our people. But it's like, it goes way beyond that. Just thinking of, how much it benefits the corporations in comparison to the actual benefits of, people in our countries. So I guess that's why we're talking, right? That's why we're having these discussions, so we can all exchange ideas and just be open to new ways of thinking. And so what would you say was like the legacy of colonization, as far as like when we were first, deemed like, okay, we're now independent from our colonial masters? In what state were we left in, essentially? Like, what was it like just right after colonization?
Yeah. And I think, okay, so this is a really interesting question, because when we talk about what has been at the heart of why Africa has been doomed, and I know, of course, Africa is a continent and we can't cover every single country because there's so many. But there was a general trend. So even when we look at the idea that, for example, when you said earlier that the United States, had a head start on many African countries and many African economies by so many years, by hundreds of years, because most of us gained independence in the 50s and the 60s. Post-independence, it really depended on the country you were in, but I'm just going to name a general trend. So, for example, in Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta was the president right after independence. And as much as we want to talk about him as as the first African ruler of the country that he actually came from, which didn't even exist prior to the British, because Kenya was never a country. None of our countries were countries. All of this was determined in the Berlin Conference, and those lines were drawn in very haphazard ways. But Jomo Kenyatta himself spent time in England. He was very much an ally to the West. So a lot of people who were implemented after independence were people who were at least allies or sympathetic to the West in some ways. Then, of course, we had a lot of socialist movements on the ground as well. Nyerere of Tanzania, Sankara of Burkina Faso, Nkrumah of Ghana, like so many different leaders who were very much pro Afro-socialism that were gunned down. And even when you think about the biggest tragedy for me, and I think also in the eyes of a lot of different historians, was the gunning down of Patrice Lumumba of Congo and the replacement of him by Mobutu Sese Seko. All of this orchestrated by the US, the CIA, and even the United Nations, the precious United Nations that we all call upon when things are going awry.
Lord.
Exactly. So pro-independence Africa was not the liberatory space we want to think it was, or even told to think it was. A lot of it was still very much being orchestrated by corporate interests. And I really like the fact that you talked about foreign companies, coming onto the continent. People think that's a sign of progress. FDIs, that's what they're called, FDIs, foreign direct investments. I would sit in my economics classes and my teachers would harp on Africa needs more foreign direct investments. But that doesn't trickle down. Just because a company is on the continent means nothing for the poorest of the poorest who live there. The idea that foreign direct investments do anything for us is 100% a neoliberal propaganda tool. And this is where I like to say that economics is so important, because when you think about, okay, let's say you don't have an economic analysis of what happened after independence, right? Let's say you pull that out, it doesn't exist to you. All you're going to see is, oh, after independence, Africa was taken over by Black leaders. That was a win. No, it wasn't, because some of those Black leaders, if been intersectional, had their own economic agendas, which did not align with the working class and the poorest of Africans. They're not your friend. Afropolitans are not your friend. I don't know if you're one of the, I think we were talking about this before, on like the preparation call, but a lot of Africans who, for example, have been able to move to the US or part of the African middle class, people in that class are not friends to the working class the same way that rich white Americans are not friends to the working class. Think about it that way. It always baffles me when people think that like rich Africans are the same as poor Africans because we're African. No, the class differentiator there is actually more powerful than the tie of like, oh, we're both Africans. No, they don't care.
That part.
Yeah.
And it's so disappointing. Because even when I like travel back home, I get the sense that once you make it out, or once you reach like that middle class or middle upper class status, there's just this often this toxic way people look at the working class, like regular folks.
Yes.
And it's so in your face, I think, in comparison to even like maybe how just like my life in the US, for instance. Like, I don't think it's as like blatant, but when you're in Africa, it's like, okay, you're you're a middle class family, you have a maid who lives in like a very rural area, and it's like there's just this weird sense of we're in charge and we have these maids and we have these people that are working for us, and it always just makes me feel so uncomfortable and just gross, just thinking through like there's certain ways you interact with certain classes of people. There's certain ways you interact with the maids and the garden boys and the servants and the people that maybe sell food in the streets. Like there's just like it's so visible, and it's just like I've even heard people make comments like, oh, like those people are like this, and there's lots of like kind of blaming of like them as like individuals for like, oh, like you're not achieving as much, or you're not as educated, blah blah blah. And there are less conversations that are focused on like, why is our country structured the way it is, and why is my life so different from like my maid or my helper's life. Like, I think we need to like start thinking in that way. Like, why is our country not ensuring that the people that work for me, essentially, or my helpers at home, also have access to healthcare, certain benefits? Like, why are their lives so much more different? Like, why are they having such a hard time? I think we need to like really take some time to examine that and like put the onus or the blame on these systems in our governments, and not the individuals for not being able to achieve this whatever middle class status.
1,000%. And something that you'll probably note is that when you ask people of the upper class or the upper middle class across different African societies, they will sound a lot like white Republicans here. They will say the whole thing of work hard. They'll say the whole pull yourself up by the bootstraps ideology because it's all rooted in neoliberalism. Whereas in the US, when we talk about these topics, we know that that is tied to a very racialized aspect of conservatism in the US, which is that because of the legacy of slavery in the United States, typically speaking, white people will form the echelon of the upper crust of society. And when they say things like work hard, it's like racialized because it's typically white people at the top and like everybody else at the bottom, right? But now we're talking about in African societies where most of us, especially, and I hate this term again, sub-Saharan African countries, most of us are Black, right? It's still the same talking point, but this time instead of being racialized, it's sometimes more like along tribal lines. Certain tribes will say, we'll work hard, knowing very well that there are issues of nepotism, issues of the legacies of post-colonial movements that have regarded certain tribes as quote unquote economically superior than others. So, for example, in Kenya, that tends to be the Kikuyus. The Kikuyus will usually be at the top. They'll be in industry, they'll be leaders of etc, whatever. It's usually like white expats, Indian business owners, because, you know, that was a huge issue. Indian business owners typically tended to come first before the Black Africans who actually inhabited the country. Then within the Black African society, it'd be like Kikuyus, because Jomo Kenyatta was Kikuyu. So all of these things, when you really look at them, yes, in the West it's racialized, but when we talk about our own different countries, it's tribalized. So sometimes it's still racialized, and you look at the general scheme of things from white, Indian, then Black. But the heart of it, what is the most recurring theme? Class, economics. That is a theme that ties everything together. Before we continue, do you want to define some terms we're going to be using? I feel like we should define capitalism, socialism, and neoliberalism, and I'm happy to define them.
Absolutely. Yes, I think that would be really important, just so we, are like listening to the episode like on the same level, essentially.
Exactly.
So yes, I guess how would you define capitalism to start with?
Yeah. So capitalism is an economic system in which capital and the means of production are owned by private entities. So it'll be like a company that's a private company, and they own the means of production. Means of production meaning capital, and in order to transform that capital, so land, raw material, resources, whatever it is, into value, they will need labor to transform that capital into value. So for example, I have a block of wood. I need this to be a pencil. I need labor to turn this into a pencil. Because I own the means of production, I decide how much I'm going to pay this laborer to turn this plank of wood into a pencil. And whatever value they create after making that pencil, I decide how much of it goes to me and how much of it goes to the laborer. Because we're talking about capitalism, I'm going to take the bulk of it, and I'm going to give the laborer the minuscule pieces of it. And that is usually the root issue of capitalism, which is that I'm the capitalist. I didn't do anything. I didn't work. Yeah, I took the risk to start this company, but the laborer who actually turned my block of wood into a pencil and provided value that wasn't there before is getting cheated at the end of the day. That's capitalism. Socialism is that the worker owns the means of production, which means that instead of there being a capitalist being like, give me your money that you made from the value that you created when you transform this block of wood into a pencil, instead of me being the capitalist saying, I'm taking your money, workers decide how much to take home because they are the ones who made the thing. They're the ones in charge of the operation because they own the means of production. They own the capital. They own the block of wood. So there's no capitalist in that scheme. So that's in a nutshell. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. But it's very simple. And then when we talk about neoliberalism, so neoliberalism is an overarching market philosophy or ideology. It's rooted in classical liberalism, which is basically, people sometimes think that liberalism is necessarily left because it's like, oh, liberal, it's in the name. But no, that is not necessarily what liberalism means. Liberalism refers to the markets. It's liberation of markets, i.e., free market ideology. Free markets require, laissez-faire capitalism, which means that there's no government intervention. When we say government intervention, we mean things like social safety nets, social programs, corrections when capitalism is running amok. So, for example, a really good example of like government intervention would be the institution of a minimum wage. I'm the government, and I'm like, hey, capitalist, you can't pay a worker 1 cent. You have to pay them at least a certain amount of money. And the capitalist is like, darn, you meddling government. So neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is the upholding of the idea that the government should not intervene in markets functions. It should let the free market distribute resources because the free market is the most adequate distributor of resources. And that is a completely crippling ideology because we all know the free market does not distribute resources equally. These are all like forms of propaganda. But most, like the US is a neoliberal economy. When we talk about post-colonialism, all of that came from neoliberalism. All the institutions that were perpetuated after, the post-colonial era were informed by neoliberalism. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, neoliberals. Even in my economics classes, back then, I was 16 when I went to college. So at that time, I was still figuring out my life. And I was like, okay, this
Nice.
sort of makes sense. But looking back, neoliberalism. And the thing about economics is that it's so informed by political interest. Economics isn't real. It's very much made up as you go along. It's not real because when you think about why certain professors would tell you certain things in class, they had their own interests given to them by the school. Who's donating to the school? And that donor who's given to the school, who are their buddies? See? Yep. Anyway, I'm gonna finish. That was
Man, thank you, Joy, for schooling us. I think, like you said, it's so important for us to really understand these systems because they literally they shape our lives, not just in Africa, globally. And having like an intimate understanding of them really can help you just look at things just so much differently. And so let's like dive into like neoliberalism and just how essentially it's kind of stalled Africa's quote unquote development. And I want to specifically kind of explore the IMF and the World Bank and their role in post-colonial Africa, essentially. I think it's really important to have a deep understanding of those institutions and their work on the continent, and really how they've impacted many of our countries under the guise of essentially wanting to, quote unquote, help us or end poverty, all of those things. And so the World Bank and IMF really have been the ones that have fueled a lot of like structural adjustment policies and essentially structured our economies in the ways that they are structured today. A lot of these like structural adjustment policies have been imposed as a way to essentially have control over a lot of African countries. And the way it's happened essentially has come with very specific terms and conditions that have required a lot of poor countries to do things like reduce spending on like health, education, and development. And they've emphasized like, okay, as the World Bank or as the IMF, we're giving you these loans. We're trying to help you out so your economy can develop, but there's strings attached. With that money comes essentially things that you have to do in effort to pay back this debt that we're offering to you. And those strings and those conditions that are attached to that money essentially have made it so that a lot of our countries have a very low standard of living. And essentially they have enriched a lot of these institutions because our money is going back to them.
Exactly.
And so, yes, I'd love your input on, structural adjustment policies and the impact that they've had on our countries.
Yeah. So structural adjustment policies, or SAPs, which is what I'll just call them so that I'm not saying the whole thing the entire time were very damaging to a lot of African economies. So basically, in the 80s, the IMF and the World Bank, which are referred to as the Bretton Woods Institution, um, gave out loans to a lot of different African countries on certain conditions. Those conditions included privatization, cutting back on government spending, reducing the balance of trade, and essentially cutting back on any government spending that was leading to a deficit. Now, that was extremely damaging because when you look at how different institutions were affected, it disproportionately hurt the poor. So, for example, when we talk about cutting back on government spending, what does that do? Infrastructure, privatized. Hospitals, privatized. So, access to healthcare now becomes something that you have to access to a private entity. And what did we talk about when we talk about capitalism? Private entities control that infrastructure, meaning they can set the price to whatever they want. And usually it's going to be at an exploitative rate in order to make a profit. So the issue with that privatization was that it left things in the hands of private institutions that could essentially do whatever. Water, privatized. General things that are for the public good were no longer public goods. They were all private goods that were owned by different multinationals and corporations. So the reason why we consider this to be neoliberal policy is because let's think back to what I said about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is about free market capitalism, no government intervention. So of course it makes sense that these SAPs or SAPs were going to cut back on so-called government intervention and call for privatization, which according to neoliberal philosophy or ideology, the private space or the private sector is the best allocator of resources because the private sector is controlled by corporate interests and the need for profit. So neoliberalism is a capitalist ideology because it removes the government from being sort of this checks and balances and creates this space within the private sector that is pretty much opaque but owns things that are supposed to be for the public. The idea was that this would lead to a lot of economic growth, increased GDP, and a number of other different forecasts that were done. But so I don't know if have you ever heard of the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman?
But I should
So
add it to my list.
yes, it's really good. I still have like my qualms about it, but basically this man worked for, these huge institutions and talks about how when it came down to the forecast that they would do about how certain neoliberal policies would impact a nation, a lot of those forecasts were made up. They were made up in order to get allowances to give those different countries loans, because essentially, when now a country is indebted to these Bretton Woods institutions, part of the reason why this even exists is because these Bretton Woods institutions are able to borrow from like larger nations like the US, for example. The US interests and the interests of the IMF and the World Bank are directly tied together. Now, you have Kenya, let's say Zambia, Ethiopia, whatever, now owing this institution all this money because the institution gave them a loan to build a dam. But to build the dam, they had to do all the things in order to qualify for the loan. So who's actually winning in this? The people and the corporations behind the building of the dam who are getting the money because they're bringing their infrastructural projects to the country. The country now owes them. Everybody's winning except the poorest people of the country. Now, here's where I'll say even the elite of that country are winning because their interests are also tied to capitalist interests, which are also tied to Western interests and all that. So again, the rich Africans are no friend to poor Africans whatsoever. And sometimes even when I look at those memes of Africa isn't poor, look, we have millionaires in Africa. And I'm like, I don't know why you bother with that statement because Africa is 100% still poor. because that wealth does not trickle down, does Aliko Dangote give the poorest of Nigerians access to his wealth from, what does he do? He makes concrete.
Yep, concrete.
Concrete conglomerate. Who sees that? That wealth does not trickle down. So it always like really baffles me when people say those kinds of things, knowing that those people are actually the purveyors of the same institutions that harm us in the end. So, yeah.
Ooh, Lord, that is a lot to unpack. But yes, I think time and time again, you see that national economic success does not trickle down to the average person. That doesn't work anywhere in the world, even though, you can look at, for instance, the US, and you can see how well we're doing as far as, economic activity. And, we are, growing, or no, let me not say we're growing really fast, but our economy is essentially like, one of the most stable and the most steady. But if you really think about it, how is wealth distributed? We're still very unequal. Poverty still exists in the US. So whether you're, in the US or you're in an African country, it's like the way our economies are structured does not allow for wealth to trickle down. And it's very concentrated with a very small percentage of people. And I wanted to just use like an example of like what happened in Ghana, because I'm trying to be more specific and like point out, different countries and not just talk about Africa, like,
Yeah.
we could get specific. And so, for instance, like in Ghana, the implementation of these SAPs like started like around the 80s, like you mentioned. And essentially, these like the World Bank, the IMF, they came in and said like, okay, we'll give you this money, but you have to cut back spending, and so what they did was they made these cuts through like social services. And so instead of, ensuring that, Ghanaians had access to healthcare, to, water and sanitation, education, it's like there was an emphasis put on other things such as increasing exports, increasing production, and yeah, increasing production of like goods such as cocoa, timber, things like that. And there wasn't really any sort of emphasis on making sure that people had access to those basic needs. And so that reform essentially was financed by more than $6 billion in loans from the World Bank and other institutions. But as we will see, like as I will explain, that wealth that was developed as a result of those adjustments did not trickle down to essentially the average Ghanaian citizen. So, for instance, these SAP policies, they drove infrastructure development in the southern region. So a lot of like the export activity happens there, while the north was ignored. And so, the export focused south represents just a small portion of the economy. That means just a small portion of people actually benefited from the investment in that particular region. And then the majority of the people who actually aren't living on like the coast, for instance, those policies didn't really make a difference in their lives. And so it's a huge problem because, like you said, a lot of these policies are put in place to benefit these institutions, these financial institutions, and to benefit corporations essentially. Because if Ghana is producing more cocoa, for instance, who's really benefiting from that? These large corporations that whatever process the cocoa, make chocolate, sell it globally. Yes, the people that are maybe working on cocoa farms benefit to some extent, but then not everyone in Ghana is going to be a cocoa farmer, right? Like not everyone does that particular kind of work. And so if you're saying let's focus on increasing cocoa exports, okay, yes, that will lead to an increase in some economic activity and like the well-being of some people. But what are we doing for the majority of people who might be better off, maybe they're more focused on agricultural activities, like other agriculture activities. So why aren't we saying, okay, if let's say 80% of the population is doing, subsistence farming and kind of small scale farming, like why aren't we making sure that we are investing in them and their ability to maybe increase crop yields or get to a point where their farms are that much more productive. Like why aren't we focusing on the majority of the population and not just like a small portion of the economy? So yeah, a lot of these policies are very problematic, given that they usually are focused on even like urban areas. Like you can't say we're helping reduce poverty in Africa, but all of your investment is happening in very limited like urban settings. Not everyone lives in an urban area. Not everyone's going to be participating in whatever economic activity is happening there. It's like whatever you do has to be inclusive of, rural areas as well.
100%. And even when you look at the example of Ghana, and where we're talking about the more export-rich regions, that's also where a lot of the infrastructure was concentrated. So it's not unlike during colonization, where infrastructure was built for the movement of goods, but sort of neglected across the rest of the country. So then you can say, oh, but look, development. But it's not development for the benefit of society. It's only building infrastructure to transport goods for the function of profit. And not only that, but when we're talking about also, alleviating poverty, at the end of the day, we have to look at wages. It's not just about, we're bringing more infrastructure to this society. It's, but what are people getting paid? And that's something that's also really key whenever we're tackling this idea of the reason why it's important to help corporations do their thing and to deregulation, low taxes on corporations is because they create jobs. But what jobs do they create? A lot of times corporations create a class of the working poor, people who work for them. But because, again, like we talked about, capitalism is about maximizing profits. How do you maximize profits? You minimize your overhead costs. What's part of your overhead costs? Labor. So how can you minimize your labor costs to maximize your profits? Pay people almost nothing to create things that will bring you a lot of value that you can charge a lot for. You steal most of that value and you give your workers scraps so that you can keep that wealth for yourself. So when we think about, what does it take to bring equity, economic equity, it's not just job creation, but it's actual job creation that can enable people to be economically empowered, because jobs for job's sake do nothing for people.
Absolutely. And job creation that's not concentrated in very specific industries. Like we need to expand beyond, we need to expand beyond like maybe like finance or whatever. Like, we're creating all these bank jobs. Like how many people are going to get a job at the bank? Like that's, that's not practical. So yes, I totally agree. Yeah. And, at the end of the day, what these structural adjustment policies or SAPs, they essentially counter like what our needs are at the moment. And so it's like, in many African contexts, or I can speak to like Zambia specifically, like there are significant gaps in like access to healthcare, access to education. We're seeing less and less improvement in like, roads and things, outside of, urban areas and things. So it's like those are things that are going to ensure that our well-being is like at an optimal level and that we can actually like be, healthy, functioning, members of society. Like we need those things, but then the policies that are put in place essentially counter that.
Mhm.
They encourage less investment in that and more in, you know, things that don't add to like our overall well-being. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's really important to like understand these things. And I think a lot of times we wonder like, oh, like why is our government, you know, structured this way? Why aren't we investing in education? Why aren't we investing in healthcare? It's like, well, if we are heavily indebted and the terms that come with, the loans that we're getting are saying, uh, don't focus on healthcare, don't focus on, access to education, like focus on, the mining sector or
Mhm.
whatever, like focus on that. It's like, okay. But with that, obviously our growth is going to be limited. Our, job creation is going to be limited and we're just going to be stalled and development is going to continue to be it's going to continue to be concentrated in very small particular areas and it's not going to be inclusive at all.
Exactly. And part of the lack of inclusivity is the fact that as things get privatized, prices do go up, but wages go down because a private company is going to suppress wages of its workers when those workers go out into society to try to purchase things, goods, whatever those purchases may be. Those things are now out of reach because they're also owned by other private entities that have pushed the price up. So it's sort of this an equal balance. So let's privatize everything. Okay, but what are the externalities of privatization? And the SAP loans did not improve wages. They in fact drove wages down, and prices went up and made public goods completely out of reach.
And what would you say is like our way out? Like, a lot of our countries are like heavily indebted to institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, other players like China, for instance. It's like how do we even move forward, if we are essentially like trapped in, debt wise. And so yeah, I think it's important to like, I guess, think through like, is it just a matter of figuring out a way to pay off this debt as soon as possible?
Mhm.
Or like in the meantime, figuring out ways to like navigate um, these terms and make them more inclusive. I don't know, I
Mhm.
guess, what the solution is.
Yeah, so this is something that every time I think of, okay, I know I can talk about the problem. When it comes to talking about the solution, it's like, oh, okay, this is hard. Of course, people go to school to study this, but there's some things that I think are important to sort of highlight. So, and I wish I was a historian so I could really be able to delineate this shift, but I mean, think back to our socialist roots on the continent. Socialism was a part of post-colonial independence movement. Even when we think about here in the West, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all those people, they were socialists. Well, okay, there's also delineations of like democratic socialists versus socialists, and that's a whole other conversation. But for the sake of this conversation, we're just going to say they were not afraid of the word socialism kind of being associated with their movement. When I think about Mandela, Mandela was part of the Communist Party, but then, sorry, and just one thing to note, socialism versus communism, both think workers should own the means of production, but socialism thinks that they should be governed through the state. Communism advocates for the lack of a state apparatus through which workers own the means of production. So that's the difference. But when I think about even, like as I was saying, Mandela was part of the Communist Party, but then eventually disassociated himself. And it's almost sad because a lot of these legacies of these sort of radical leaders really got diluted as they had to make certain political alliances, or, as we've seen more favorably, back when Mandela was doing his thing with Mkhonto Wesizwe, he was considered a terrorist, a communist terrorist, and he was on the terror watch list. Um, um, but then, I think as a function of sort of that neoliberal global appetite, his legacy became very, very thin in the sense of that radicalism that drove him in the beginning. I mean, that's to say that we have a rich history of socialist, communist movements on the continent. It's important to go back to them. I want to talk about Patrice Lumumba here because I think that his legacy is really important. So, of course, Congo, we know the legacy of Congo with Leopold and the Belgians in general, with the brutal colonialism that took place there. And post independence, it's not that Congo was completely free of that grasp. There were a lot of multinational corporations, of course, who had a deep interest in Congo's mineral fields. So what Patrice Lumumba advocated for was the nationalization of Congo's natural resources. Now, nationalization, what is that? Making those things public, like owned by the government, essentially. Neoliberal appetites did not want that. They wanted that privatized so that corporations could take advantage of it. When I think about the Microsofts of the world, I mean, back then it wasn't Microsoft because it didn't exist back then, but they all now benefit from that legacy of the privatization of those mines and of all of that mineral wealth so that they could do whatever they wanted with it. I remember my dad used to work for the UN back when he lived in Nairobi, and he would talk about how when he went to Congo, like DRC, the planes that would take off and land, all full of minerals, constant, every second of the day. So Patrice Lumumba wanted to nationalize minerals of Congo, and he was assassinated by, of course, by the West, by the CIA. The CIA has since admitted that they took him out. So we had a lot of leaders that were pushing for wealth creation through using our natural resources. Anti-imperialist movements were also anti-capitalist movements at the heart of them. But people forget that. That legacy is lost. In fact, a lot of people on the continent don't really connect with that heart of the movement because the heart of socialism has been lost because of so much neoliberal propaganda. Even when you think about when we were growing up, I'm sure your parents told you, work hard, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. All that ideology, it's really neoliberal ideology at the heart of it. So could we go back in time and stop the CIA from doing its thing and taking out our leaders? Of course not. But at the heart of it, empowering workers, nationalizing wealth and distributing wealth through the public sector is how we propel the content forward.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for speaking to his legacy. I think it's important to know that we had leaders like him who wanted to ensure that our countries were essentially structured in a way that would benefit our people. And so I think that context is like helpful, especially as like a lot of us sometimes look at the continent as like, oh my gosh, we have just been making bad decision after bad decision. We don't have good leaders. We need more people who are pro us or pro Africa. And it's like, yeah, we have, historically had leaders like that, but oftentimes when they veered too far from, the interests of the West, it's like, all right, we're going to take you out.
Exactly.
Like you no longer have, you're no longer going to live essentially. And I think it's just so wild to just think about throughout history. It's like, we've wanted to, advance or continue to advance our nations and our people But so long as a lot of our work doesn't align with the interests of, these bigger powers, it's like we're always just cut short or, interrupted or disrupted in some way. But I really think, we should all study like socialism and just the legacy of like, African like socialist movements and um, even like as I was doing like my research, my president or the first president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, he had his philosophy was like humanism essentially. And it was like pretty much rooted in like treating all of our citizens as humans and ensuring like all the policies that are put in place are, pro-human, pro our well-being. Now, did that last or did that, were those policies, strong enough or implemented well enough to kind of last, for decades? Like, no, essentially, like our country is still structured very much in a capitalist way. But I think it's important to know that we have had leaders with the vision and the foresight to know like the way the West recommends that we structure our economies just isn't inherently African, essentially, because a lot of our societies, just how they function for millennia, has been very social and not focused on like the needs of the individual. It's been very communal, and we've always just approached how we relate to each other and work with each other in that way. Do you think, though, it's possible to have elements of socialism in this current context, like given that a lot of our countries are not not socialist and they are very much structured to benefit benefit the West, and they're very capitalist.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because sometimes when I talk to my dad, we rant about politics all the time, like at the dinner table, like, and one of the things that he says that's so interesting and so profound is that, when I think about American libertarians or American conservatives who want pure, unadulterated capitalism, they should really just go to Kenya or go to a lot of African countries where regulations pretty much don't exist. There's so much corruption in the system that people are basically left to fend for themselves. So even think about like libertarians essentially, they're capitalists within an anarcho-capitalist like sense. So they want capitalism without the government. And what that leads to is privatization of everything. Every single aspect of society is completely privatized because there should be no governmental intervention whatsoever, not even an inkling of it. And my dad is always like, that's the pure capitalism that they want. Okay, come to Kenya then, because that's what we have essentially. Or many other African countries are very much that way. The rich have these gated communities where they live, but let the rich have a heart attack. The road that the ambulance needs to go on to take them from their homes to the hospital, you'll die on the way. Yeah, because there's no public investment into that infrastructure. So how do we? So your question was, can aspects of socialism be embedded? I think that would depend on a lot of different things. One of them is the fact that like a lot of our governments do abdicate their responsibility to the people. So if we were to have aspects of socialism into society sort of implemented, it would need the government to actually respond to the people. We've had that in the past. Sankara of Burkina Faso, of course, was a really shining light of that. He was, of course, also assassinated by the French and their co-conspirators. But we've had aspects of it before. Today, I don't know if it's possible because our leaders, first of all, pocket a lot of money that belongs to the people. There's nobody is going to hold them accountable. Even when the West does this whole thing of, we're going to send you to the ICC. It's all a charade. It's all theater. It's political theater for us to feel better. But at the end of the day, nothing really changes.
It's just so crazy to think about, especially when you point to things like, our phones and, this technology and, all of these, the minerals that are core to, developing these things, where are they produced, or not produced, where are the minerals extracted from?
Exactly.
Primarily in African countries. And then, beyond just the extraction of the minerals, it's like we don't really own other components of like the value chain. Like we're not processing the minerals. We're not like getting, the first, I don't know how phones are built, but we're not getting like the first components built, in our countries. It's like, all of that, like after the minerals are extracted, it's taken to where? To China and places like that. And
it's very destructive. I think one of the solutions is following that vision that Lumumba had was to nationalize these minerals and to ensure that they're enriching the countries that they come from, because even a capitalist could own the value chain of those minerals. Let's say Dangote decides to expand his business and go into minerals. That doesn't mean he's actually giving anything to his laborers, the people who, because also when you for example, when you mine diamonds, they don't look shiny at first. They go through a whole process, of course, to become what they are. How are people getting paid along that process? What does their life look like? Just because they're African doesn't mean the person who's owning that production doesn't mean just because the person who's on the production of that process is African doesn't mean that they're African laborers who are actually giving what was once a rock the value of a diamond, their fair wage. So the answer at the end of the day is to mobilize the working class, to nationalize these industries, and to ensure that people are getting paid fair wages. And also it benefits the whole society, people to have money to spend in the society and circulate the value of the shilling, the other currencies. I'm blanking on other currencies that exist.
You are fine. You are fine.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, but I totally agree. And I would love to get, I don't want to keep going on and on, but, I'd love to get your thoughts on, for instance, like you read about like Botswana and, how, they essentially were able to strike this, this partnership with like De Beers, when De Beers was like, all right, we need your diamonds. And, it was like I think it was like a 50-50 like partnership essentially. So, 50% or even more of the profits were like made from those diamonds were going back into, the Botswanan government. And, people credit Botswana's quote unquote economic growth from like, policies like that. But then I think it's so easy to feed into that narrative. Like, oh my gosh, okay, look, it worked in this context. But then when you look at it, on all measures, Botswana is still very unequal. Yes, their GDP per capita is like at like, it's super high, like in comparison to a lot of other African countries. I think it's just a little under like, I think maybe $19,000. But then with that, it's like, who really is getting $19,000 in Botswana? It's going to be a very limited amount of people because, if you're investing super heavily into the diamond mining industry, like, okay, great, you see growth and activity from that. But then people who aren't in those sectors, what are they doing? Are they just completely left out? Like, essentially, that's what it is, because you see that it's still unequal. And so it's like, it's just so frustrating because even these quote unquote outliers that people point out, like Botswana, like still at the end of the day, if it's still like structured as a capitalist system, still only just a very few will benefit.
Exactly. And actually, one thing I want to just really clarify for listeners is why things don't trickle down. Because I think a lot of people say that and they're like, yeah, trickle down economics doesn't work, but they don't actually know why it doesn't work. And I just want to clarify that because exactly as you said, who benefits from the GDP, right? Okay, so I'm a company, I'm doing my thing, I'm producing, I'm earning millions of dollars, and dollars too, because dollars translated to my local currency is going to be even more. But instead of bringing it back into the country, I'm putting it in an offshore account. So that's one way it doesn't trickle down. Instead of paying my workers, I'm hoarding it, or I'm giving myself a big cut so that I'm making millions while my workers are still making nothing. That's another way it doesn't trickle down. So the fallacy of economics is the idea that when, let's say I'm a capitalist, I'm making a lot of money, I'm going to pay my workers more, or I'm going to invest in certain things in society. I'm going to pay my taxes. The thing is, the wealthy don't do that. They don't pay their taxes. They hide their money and paintings. They buy paintings, so you can't tax that. They put it in Swiss banks. It's out of reach. The wealthy also don't pay their workers more. They give themselves bigger cuts of the salary, which is why every workplace should have a union, so that the exec team isn't just taking more. And that's also part of why when people say things like, "Oh, we iPhones have to cost a lot of money." We have to pay people almost nothing to make iPhones, because if we paid them a living wage, it would make iPhones really, really expensive. But the problem with that is that no, it doesn't have to make iPhones more expensive. Apple could just make less profits. But Apple isn't going to do that, because capitalism, the value of capitalism is that you're supposed to make the most profits as possible. That's the ethics of capitalism. And then also when I said they don't pay taxes as well. Oh wait, I already said that. Don't pay taxes, don't pay their workers more, and they hide their money to not pay taxes. And also like they'll put them in the stock market as well. Like even in the US, during COVID, a lot of companies made a lot of money, put their money in the stock market. It doesn't trickle down. So the stock market isn't the economy. That's part of why, because that money is like completely arbitrarily. It's like I make all these profits, I give my exec board all this money, they put that money into the stock market, and then what happens? Nobody sees it. So, and guess what? All that money is created by the labor of who? The workers. The value is from the workers. The workers are at the heart of everything. So I just wanted to make sure to give some examples to people, so that next time somebody tells them trickle-down economics works, they have examples of why it doesn't.
Yes. Thank you so much for breaking that down. That is super helpful. And it sounds like really we need to just be more pro-worker, first of all.
Exactly.
Pro-worker, and maybe be not so greedy and focused on profiting, focus on profits primarily at the expense of, workers and other people. So
Exactly.
wow. Thank you so much, Joy. I have learned so much from this conversation, and I really, really appreciate your perspective. And it's clear that you know your stuff, you know your history. And I encourage everyone, first to share this episode with everyone. Share this episode, and then also follow Joy and her work with the Down Ballot. It's, again, like I said earlier in the episode, it's very educational, it's very direct, and it makes you just think like, oh, like I've been looking at this particular thing in the wrong way, or in just, a way that's not as nuanced. And so I really appreciate your content for being able to do that. And, every time I watch something, I'm like, ooh, let me do some research. Like, let me learn more about this. So yeah, definitely appreciate what you do. And yeah, do you want to let folks know like how to find you online, or how to support your work, all of that jazz?
Awesome. Thank you. So find me online at the Down Ballot on Instagram. Thedownballot.org is also our website, but it's mostly focused on US politics. So, you decide as the audience if that is of interest to you if you're not in the US. And you can also find us on TikTok as well at thedownballot.org.
Yes, excellent. Again, thank you, Joy. It was such a pleasure, and I'm so excited to share this episode. Everybody.
Thanks for having me. This was an awesome conversation.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Be sure to follow the Down Ballot on social media. I'll be sure to include those links in the description. And don't forget, there's a way to support the podcast. If you like what you hear, you can always buy us a coffee via the Buy Me a Coffee platform. I will also link to that in the description. And don't forget to share this with a friend. If you know someone that would really enjoy this content, be sure to send them a link to the podcast. Talk to you soon.